Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our business webinar on Community Choice Energy and the Silicon Valley Community Choice Energy Partnership. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Don Bray. I'm with Joint Venture Silicon Valley, and I'll be serving as our moderator this morning. The purpose of the webinar is to engage with prospective commercial energy customers and stakeholders and provide an update on the formation of the Community Choice Energy Agency here in Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of progress on this since our last business webinar in November, and some major milestones on the immediate horizon that we want to tell you about. We know that many of you are from large organizations with sophisticated energy demands, and for those of you that are newer to the topic or didn't attend the November webinar, we'll briefly review some of the motivations for community choice and the basics of how it works. Then we'll go into some more detail on the recent developments, including the results of the technical study that was completed late in November. We have some excellent and now that I look at the picture, sartorially resplendent presenters lined up for you today. It's probably been a while since we've all looked this good. I'm joined by Glenn Hendricks, Melody Tovar, and Kirby Dussel. Glenn Hendricks has served as a city council member in Sunnyvale since 2014 and was recently selected by the council to serve as the city's new mayor. Mayor Hendricks is a Sunnyvale native and sees implementation of the Community Choice Energy Program as one of the city's top priorities for the coming year. Fittingly, in a community like Sunnyvale, he brings a high-tech business background to his role as mayor. He currently serves as a senior engineering manager at PayPal, and prior to that held technical positions with other high-tech companies and startups in the area. Melody Tovar is the City of Sunnyvale's Regulatory Programs Division Manager and the overall project team lead for the Silicon Valley CCE Partnership. She has an extensive background in environmental program management and engineering with over 20 years of municipal experience across the cities of Sunnyvale and San Jose. Melody will take us through some of the basics of community choice, the formation efforts behind the partnership, and critical next steps. And Kirby Dussel is on the line from Sacramento. Kirby is Vice President and co-founder of Pacific Energy Advisors. They're an independent energy consulting firm that provides strategic advice and technical support to organizations within the California energy market. He has the unique qualifications of having served as a lead technical consultant to California's first community choice agencies in Marin County, Sonoma County, and the city of Lancaster, and has extensive expertise in the areas of resource procurement and planning. Kirby was one of the principal authors of the Silicon Valley Community Choice Technical Study, and he'll take us through the study analysis, energy sourcing, cost scenario, and key findings. I'll also briefly introduce Allison Elliott with Lean. She's at the webinar controls and will be helping to route participant questions to us as they come in. Participants are in listen-only mode, and questions can be submitted via the question box that you see on your screen. We'll endeavor to keep a close eye on these as they come in, and if the questions are brief, we'll answer them as we go. Otherwise, we'll queue them up for the Q&A topic later in the session. As we get started, here's a quick one-slide snapshot of what Community Choice Energy is and how it works. And in effect, it's a hybrid utility model. A traditional investor-owned utility, as shown on the left column, is responsible for generating or purchasing power, maintaining transmission and distribution lines, and providing service connection and billing functions. And on the right, in a municipal or public utility model, a city department is responsible for the same full stack of functions, and locally the cities of Palo Alto and Santa Clara operate mini utilities. With community choice, though, as shown in the middle, a new public agency is formed that assumes responsibility for managing power generation and procurement on behalf of the community of customers that it serves. At the same time, the investor-owned utility, PG&E, continues to manage the remaining elements of distribution, service connection, and billing. So in this model, the Community Choice Agency decides what types of power generation to utilize and procure, what new power offerings to make available to customers, and at what prices, and what it is that you'll ultimately see on the generation portion of your power bill. We'll talk more about the details of how this works as we go and why there's so much local interest in it, but at the highest level, this is the concept. Our agenda today looks like this. We'll first hear from Mayor Hendricks on what's motivating community choice in our area. Melody will take us through an overview of community choice energy and the current status of the local agency formation efforts. And she'll be followed by Kirby, who will take us through the key elements of the technical study. After that, we'll open it up for Q&A and wrap things up with a quick review of how you can stay close to development activities going forward. With that, I will turn it over to Mayor Hendricks.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Glenn Hendricks, the mayor of Sunnyvale, and I want to say thank you to everybody who's on the phone for participating in this and trying to learn more about what's going on. I'll just have a few brief comments. As with many communities considering CCE, the primary driver for why Sunnyvale is looking at this is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in support of our climate action objectives. That's because electricity consumption is a significant source of GCG, emissions. So tackling how that energy is used and sourced becomes essential to achieving our climate goals. Sunnyvale identified in its climate action plan that community choice energy is the single most efficient and impactful strategy we can take to impact that. And I want to say this other piece as well that has to do with the community's engagement on this. There are many people out there that don't believe that climate change is actually a problem. And the reason they don't believe that is because if they believe it's a problem, then they have to go ahead and do something about it. And up till this, most solutions or things that people can do either cost more money or require behavioral change. And one of the great, wonderful things about the CCE, if I can get my alphabets correct, I'll be doing great here. But one of the great benefits about this is you can go ahead and do this, and it doesn't cost more money, and it doesn't require behavioral change. So as we take a look at not only is it a great program to do, but the ability for people to go ahead and implement it and be involved and support it is really very high. The barrier to involvement and to acceptance by the community is extremely low. So in 2014, on the heels of adopting our CAP, we directed staff to investigate the feasibility of such a program and to see if other communities in our regions, because this hopefully is a regional solution, would be involved or would be interested. And lo and behold, they were. The Silicon Valley Community Choice Energy Partnership was formed by the cities of Sunnyvale, Cupertino, and Mountain View, along with the County of Santa Clara, to investigate the viability of a multi-jurisdictional program for Santa Clara communities. And these 4 agencies were the sponsoring partners to go ahead and get this started and sharing the cost to go ahead and get things started. And Melody, there's actually, I believe, 6 cities so far that have unanimously voted to join our partnership.
Now 8.
Now 8. See, I'm not even up on it.
Just last night.
So here we have 8 Santa Clara counties that have agencies that have stepped forward to consider participation and forming this regional partnership that could grow to as large as 12 is what we see today and could even grow larger than that over time. As a partnership, we've developed a set of priority goals to focus our efforts. Chief among them has been to offer better renewable energy options and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is our goal to do this at a competitive and aiming for lower rates for customers. We know that here in Silicon Valley, many of our businesses share these goals and have already made big, bold commitments to and investments in renewable energy. Many of the businesses who specialize in these technologies that we will shape how we use and save energy are also right here. We've embodied these in our goals here in Silicon Valley. There is unparalleled opportunity to leverage this kind of program to facilitate the use of clean energy and energy innovators. And last but not least, it is essential that the agency form be well managed and financially sustainable. I'd like to thank you for your time that you're taking today and encourage you to stay engaged as we proceed forward with the decision making and building a successful program that is going to be good for our residents here in the city of Sunnyvale, but also for the broader region that we're operating in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. We will now turn it over to Melody, who's going to provide a brief overview of the community choice and then talk specifically about the development activities that are underway with formation of the new, it's going to be called Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority. Melody?
Thank you, Don. Here's another graphic supporting Don's great introduction of what community choice energy is. This is one we use frequently in our outreach, and it shows those same critical components, that you have the new CCE as an entity responsible for sourcing electricity, still in critical partnership with PG&E, who will be continuing its role in delivering energy, and then also continuing to provide connection and billing services to customers. We also like to highlight here that there are a couple of other program fundamentals to get across. One, in this kind of program, by law, customers are automatically enrolled over time. So the customer does not have to take any action in order to participate, just like the mayor was saying earlier. Customers also have a choice. They can elect to stay with PG&E if they prefer for all of their services, doing what we call opting out of the CCE program. And they're given plenty of opportunities to do so. They receive at least 4 formal notices, 2 before their enrollment period and 2 after their enrollment period. So choice remains at the center of this kind of program. For customers, the transition is seamless. Here's an example of a bill from Marin Clean Energy's program, and you can see that the only difference here is that they still get a bill from PG&E, but there's a generation services line that now designates that electricity is coming from the Community Choice Energy program, here shown with the red box outlined. Marin Clean Energy is just one of the programs that has inspired and encouraged us along the way. Here we're showing information for Sonoma Clean Power as well. These are the 2 multi-jurisdictional operating programs here in California, and they have been offering their customers greener power with a mix that features more renewable energy than PG&E. The chart here shows the power mix of Sonoma compared to that of PG&E. There on the left you see that PG&E is at 27% renewable energy in their portfolio, with other greenhouse gas-free sources coming from large hydro and nuclear, and then shown in gray, conventional energy sources. By comparison in the middle, you can see that Sonoma customers are automatically enrolled in their baseline Clean Start program with more renewable energy and more GHG-free energy than PG&E. On the far right, you can see that customers can also take one more option. They can opt up to their Evergreen program for a price premium, wherein they get 100% renewable energy. We also observe that these existing programs are achieving this kind of outcome at competitive, currently lower rates for their customers, and they're doing so while also offering enhanced local energy efficiency and solar programs. And we're also excited to announce that they're both performing financially well, independent of the member cities and completely self-sustaining. This model of having a baseline program and then offering premium options for customers is an approach that's taken by all 3 of the existing community choice programs in California. Here's just a quick overview of those 3 programs. We've talked about Marin. They've now been operating for 5 years. Sonoma for more than 2. And then here on the lower part of the slide, Lancaster Choice Energy, a single city community choice program just launched last year. And as we said, these programs are offering lower greenhouse gas emission supply. Here's another comparison view of Sonoma. We looked before at their overall power mix. Here we're just showing the greenhouse gas emissions comparison. And you can see the significant greenhouse gas reductions being achieved by, again, their baseline Clean Start program and their premium Evergreen program. A question we often receive goes straight to rate structure. How will a rate structure look for a community choice program, and how does it compare to PG&E? And in general, these programs tend to just mirror the rate structure of the utility so that you can facilitate an easy comparison of rates for customers. Here's an example from Sonoma showing a breakdown rate charge for the E19 Commercial 19 schedule. And you can also see the rate savings for this particular customer from their Clean Start program in the middle and the premium for their Evergreen 100% renewable program on the right. We've also been encouraged by how the existing programs are able to advance innovative programs and projects. Marin Clean Energy has a 10-megawatt solar array going up at the Chevron refinery in Richmond as part of a public-private partnership. And in Sonoma, they're doing a similarly sized array floating on top of irrigation ponds in partnership with the Sonoma County Water Agency. So in both cases, they've been able to facilitate and invest in large array projects, bringing more solar to their communities and encouraging local solar growth. Marin in particular has been in operation longer, and they've moved forward with enhanced energy efficiency programs too. they've been able to apply for and secure additional statewide funding for local energy efficiency programs to the tune of more than $5 million over a 3-year period. These programs are then available to their community in addition to existing state and PG&E programs also offered. And they're looking at newer partnerships. They've recently begun one with Tesla to promote on-premise battery storage. So we look forward to exploring here in our area how we can leverage the innovative and forward-thinking spirit here in Silicon Valley to create new and exciting opportunities for residents and businesses. How is a CC operated and governed? Well, our partnership engaged all 12 of the prospective communities in building the governance framework for this new small public agency called Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority. The program would be governed by a joint powers agency and have representation from each of the participating communities' city councils or board. We looked really closely at and we leveraged liberally from the JPA structure for the existing programs. Procedurally, they would meet monthly, and it would be in a public setting just like city council meetings are. So there would be a public hearing process, particularly associated with key decisions around procurement and rates, et cetera. And the operations supporting the JPA would be run by staff that are specifically hired for special expertise in the essential functional areas of operating this kind of enterprise. As to our partnership process, we are amidst a key shift. Our work has been part of a multi-phase work plan shown here in quite a bit of detail. We are wrapping that evaluation stage, phase 1, and shifting to phase 2 and 3, program development and launch. We've also developed there along the bottom a working timeline showing the current work of the technical study having been completed, with the next critical step being the formation of the Joint Powers Authority this season, followed by developing the program and submitting a formal plan to the California Public Utilities Commission for their approval. We'll also be securing energy contracts and other services to support the operations and overall ramping up on community engagement and operations through the summer and into fall, all geared up for program launch in early 2017. Here's a schedule of where the various communities are with deciding to go forward with forming the JPA. And it's no wonder that we all can't be on top of this every moment. It's happening as scheduled here at a decent clip. So right now we have 8 communities who have voted to move forward with a community choice energy program and this JPA. And we have the remaining 4 scheduled to happen throughout February. This high level of acceptance and support has really been heavily based on the robust technical study, which you're now going to hear about next.
Okay, thanks, Melody. When we noted that a lot has happened since November, this slide sums that up pretty well. In addition, the technical study was completed. Kirby had a big hand in it and is going to take us through a review of it. Kirby, do we have you on?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Go away.
Appreciate the opportunity to walk through the study results here. And also thanks for helping me advance the slide deck. So really what we're going to go through today is an overview of the technical study, a little bit of information regarding the methodology that was applied in completing the study, a summary of the electric usage within the region, within the 12 CCE study partner communities, a summary of the 3 different supply scenarios that were analyzed as part of the technical study, acknowledging that you have a broad range of options and how it is that you choose to implement a CCE program. You can imagine we had to choose just a few of those particular approaches and study them, and so that's what we'll be going over today, and then also the conclusions that were drawn as a result of completing the study process. Next slide, please. I think it's probably worth pointing out that for those of you that may have taken the opportunity to review the study, it's probably something that includes quite a lot of information. For some of you, you may be familiar with a lot of the information included in there, as well as the terminology that's being used. But I think it's worth just taking a moment to point out that the purpose of the technical study wasn't to create a detailed business plan for any particular program that might be administered by the CCE program. It's really to take a look at whether or not this particular business model is viable in consideration of the participating customers, the manner in which they use energy, the current market conditions that we would be buying electric power in, including renewable energy, as well as existing legislation and regulations. And in consideration of all those factors, is this really a viable concern? And so in taking a look at this, the study really starts with developing a detailed understanding of the manner in which participating customers use electric energy and what different tariff designations those customers take service under, namely residential, commercial, and the like, and all the different flavors of those tariff options that exist. Once that data is collected from PG&E, that data flows through a series of different analyses, one looking at the different supply portfolio compositions that could be employed by the CCE in serving its customers, another looking at the operating results through a pro forma analysis, taking into consideration the various costs associated with procuring power, hiring staff, and administering other programs of the CCE, and then also, of course, looking at how it is that rates ultimately compare at the end of the day. And that comparison is based on a forecast of PG&E's rates that takes into consideration current rates presently, as well as a build-up over time in consideration of various publicly available information that we have access to. And so all of that information really comes together in the form of the technical study. And so that's really what we're going to be going over right now. Next slide, please. So here you have the electric load composition of the 12 CCE study partners. And you can see here, I think it's worth pointing out, that the information displayed on this slide only reflects the bundled electric accounts that could be served by the CCE program. Many of you are probably familiar with that term, but when I say bundled, I mean accounts that are currently served by PG&E. Within the communities of the CCE study partners, that proportion of accounts represents about 83% of the total. So many of you may have some or all of your accounts currently served on alternative options such as direct access. And within the communities of the CCE study partners, about 17% of the electric energy is served under those sorts of arrangements. And again, in this table right here, those direct access accounts and their electric load is excluded from this summary. So you can see here, there's about 240,000 prospective accounts within the region, comprising about 4 million megawatt hours of annual electric energy use. About 90% of those accounts fall into the residential rate classification, but those 90% of the accounts only use 34% of the electric energy, which means that about 10% of the accounts, of course, make up the balance. So you've got about 66% of the energy that's being used within the commercial rate designation. Peak demand is 660 megawatts, and that occurs during the summer month of July. Next slide, please. So this here is just kind of a more community-specific breakout of the information that we saw on the last slide. You can see here that of the 12 CCE study partners, 5 of those jurisdictions account for almost 76% of total electric consumption and 68% of the total accounts. So depending on where your business is located, you can see from the bar chart here just how it is that you fit into the overall composition. Sunnyvale is of course based on the information that we received from PG&E, both the largest energy user in terms of overall electric consumption, and also represents having the largest number of consumer accounts. Next slide, please. So once we have a handle on the manner in which customers use electric energy within the region, now comes the task of figuring out what different supply scenarios we're really going to study. For purposes of this exercise, we looked at 3 distinct supply scenarios, and when deciding upon those different scenarios, it was really important to understand that there are trade-offs in each one of these scenarios based on the different levers that you can pull. The levers, of course, being varying quantities of renewable energy, additional carbon-free energy supplies, namely hydroelectric energy that may be available from within California or elsewhere within the Pacific Northwest, complementary energy programs such as energy efficiency, demand response, other local renewable energy programs that might promote distributed generation, and the like. And to the extent that those features are incorporated within a particular scenario, you can imagine that it does put upward pressure on price. And so this balancing act is really what we're left with. And so in framing these different supply scenarios, that was something that we tried to be mindful of, is just trying to paint a very broad picture of the different approaches that could be taken by the CCE in implementing its program, highlighting situations in which kind of rate competitiveness could be maximized, environmental benefits could be maximized, and then kind of a midpoint as well. And again, the CCE would not be constrained by any of the scenarios that were detailed in the technical study. It could really choose any different supply mix that it prefers. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Really another key piece of the puzzle, and Melody already touched on this in an earlier slide, but a key piece of the puzzle is how do the scenarios that you're constructing as part of the study, how do they compare to what's currently offered by the incumbent utility? And you can see here PG&E's most recent power content label, basically. This is, of course, the same information that was included in that label, just put into a slightly different form. As a PG&E customer, you'll likely receive this information already as a bill insert. And you can see here that PG&E, as far as utilities go, has a very relatively high level of renewable energy at 27%, and then additional clean energy supplies in the form of hydroelectric power and nuclear. And so this was something that we tried to be mindful of, not just how the supply portfolio looked in retrospect, but also how that supply portfolio is likely to change over time in consideration of applicable laws, namely California's Renewable Portfolio Standard that was recently increased to 50% by 2030, as well as other clean energy objectives that exist. Next slide, please. So after considering all this, the three different supply scenarios that were arrived at can be expressed in kind of the following broad terms. Scenario one was primarily focused on matching PG&E's greenhouse gas emissions composition while exceeding marginally PG&E's renewable energy percentage, with the absolute goal really being maximizing rate savings. I'll go ahead and flip now to the kind of the right side of the slide, the other bookend, if you will, which was scenario three. And this was really all about maximizing environmental benefits, both emissions reductions and also overall renewable energy content. The goal here being that customer cost impacts would essentially be zero. You'd have cost equivalency on net. And then the middle scenario, if you will, scenario two, was trying to strike a balance between rate savings and environmental benefits. And in this case, the scenario was targeting a 20% GHG emissions reduction, as well as considerable increases to the renewable energy supply portfolio, starting at 51% in year one, growing to 66% by year 10, while also reflecting a nice level of customer savings. And you can see on the bottom here some of the additional assumptions that were included in our supply scenarios, namely, I think, the no unbundled direct box, which is right in the middle of the bottom row. I think that was something that was very important for the project team, excluding those particular resources that have become increasingly objectionable over time, and also excluding the purchases of nuclear and coal resources, which have also received some negative attention over time. Next slide, please. So this is another summary of the year one operating results that were projected under each one of the supply scenarios. You can see the pie charts up at the top and how they reflect the different resource mix within each supply scenario, and then the table below that illustrates the different renewable and GHG-free content that would be achieved in year one for each one of the different supply scenarios, as well as the projected savings for each one of those scenarios. And you can see, moving left to right, scenario one, which of course had the lowest level of environmental impacts, achieved a 4% savings relative to PG&E. And I think it's noteworthy that for those of you that choose to review the technical study, that 4% savings is based on the total electric bill. So this is inclusive of generation charges as well as delivery charges, not natural gas charges, just the electric charges, but the totality of those charges nonetheless. Scenario two, slightly lower savings, averaging 3% in year one, and then moving on to scenario three, virtual rate parity with savings under 1% in year one. On the bottom there, as we already discussed, scenario one was intended to match PG&E's GHG emission profile, so there were estimated to be no environmental impacts in that regard. Scenario two, a rather nice reduction in GHG emissions at 20% relative to the incumbent utility. And then scenario three, again, trying to optimize environmental impacts, resulted in a 60% GHG emissions reduction relative to the incumbent utility.
Kirby, if I can interrupt for a moment here, we do have a number of questions coming in, and we're logging these as we go, but there's one that's clarification oriented. Are the assumptions at the bottom of slide 27 here based on the number of customers or the percent of power used for the opt-out and participation assumptions?
Yeah, it's really both. Yeah, but ultimately, I think what's important to focus on there is that we're talking about 85% of the electric energy relative to what's currently being served by PG&E.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so just kind of going back to environmental impacts for a minute, many of your organizations likely have corporate sustainability goals and other environmental objectives as part of your various plans, and you can see here how those considerations kind of flow through each one of the different scenarios, and these are all expressed as kind of averages over the 10-year study period. The first row, of course, being the annual change in GHG emissions, and then that number being expressed as a percentage in the second row. The third row is simply the GHG emissions factor, which is a metric used to express the emissions intensity of a particular fuel mix used by an individual utility. And then, of course, the bottom row there being kind of the base case, which is, of course, PG&E's emission factor over the 10-year study period. So moving left to right, of course, you can see how the environmental impacts increase as increased amounts of renewable energy and additional GHG-free supply is infused in the supply portfolio, resulting in some very substantial emissions reductions over the study period. Next slide. So, as you can imagine, a new utility such as this, forming that type of organization is not without risks and uncertainties. I think really key among those risks and uncertainties are market prices and the volatility of electric prices within the utility industry generally. Wholesale electricity prices are prone to change significantly and suddenly, But over the last few years, we've been in a very prolonged trough, if you will, in terms of electricity pricing, largely driven by depressed natural gas prices. That's certainly related to a very robust supply of domestic natural gas and also accumulation of storage reserves as well that have kind of held down natural gas prices to historically low levels for a very prolonged period of time. And those natural gas prices are really the key driver for wholesale electric prices. So while we've seen this very bearish market, which has been very favorable for energy buyers, that could certainly change over time, and it's certainly good to be mindful of that. Of course, PG&E's rates are prone to change, oftentimes multiple instances of changes throughout the year, and that's something that becomes a key bogey, if you will, for the CCE program and how it is that the CCE's rates compare to PG&E's rates. Of course, PG&E, for a certain portion of their electric energy needs, they're buying in the same marketplace as the CCE, so there's some similarity in the exposure there that exists for both the utility and the CCE, and so you could expect that for shorter-term purchases, there will be similar impacts on both PG&E rates as well as CCE rates. I think one of the things to really be mindful of as new CCE entities form throughout the state of California, and those CCE entities are increasingly focused on environmental objectives, I think one of the things to be concerned about is the availability of clean energy resources, and in particular, larger hydroelectric resources throughout the region. As you can imagine, there is a significant amount of seasonal variability in hydroelectric production, and that can also change dramatically from year to year. With recent drought conditions, of course, in the state of California, hydroelectric production has been depressed quite a lot, but it's remained rather robust elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And again, as new CCE organizations decide to form and commit to environmental objectives that will require the purchase of these types of resources, it's reasonable to assume that there will be upward pressure on pricing for large hydroelectric energy supplies, which may force CCEs to consider trade-offs between additional renewable energy in lieu of the unavailability of large hydroelectricity. Also, to date, as new entities, CCEs can be challenged from a credit perspective. Making large commitments contractually on a forward basis for electricity does take credit support, as you can imagine, and as a new entity which has insulated its member municipalities from any financial risks, that can present a challenge, but there have been contractual mechanisms that have been put in place very effectively by California's operating CCAs to address that issue and kind of allow it to operate in the early years in lieu of those concerns. Then I think one of the other things that needs to be considered, but doesn't need to really scare anybody off necessarily, is the potential for future legislation that may present adverse consequences for CCEs. I know that each one of the operating CCEs has one or more lobbyists working in Sacramento on their behalf, and those individuals, in concert with the staff of the CCE entities, have been very effective in fending off legislative attacks that could hamper the autonomy of CCE organizations or other program elements that might be of interest to CCEs. And then, of course, the regulations that might flow through as the result of new legislation. Those are things that require quite a lot of day-to-day attention on the part of the CCE, working with entities like the California Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission to represent interests of the CCE to make sure that they can continue operating in the manner that they've been able to in the past. Opt-out rate uncertainty, what level your participation is actually going to be at, that is a concern, but through the technical study we did analyze a very broad range of opt-out scenarios. I think taking down participation to as low as 68% of our initial expectations, so that is equivalent to about a 32% opt-out rate, and program viability was still very high, even with that stress test, if you will. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit more information on the different cost sensitivities that were analyzed as part of the study. You can see here how the different scenarios, the range, of course, of the different costs that could flow through is represented by the length of the bar, of course, the top of the bar being the maximum, the bottom being the minimum, and then the arrow being the midpoint within each one of these scenarios. And then you can see moving left to right from scenario 1 through 3, and then the rightmost line being PG&E bundled service. You can see that there is a kind of a broad band within which the CCE remains very competitive with PG&E. And really the primary drivers within these different sensitivity analyses that we looked at are renewable energy prices, PG&E generation rates, and then also PG&E exit fees. So some of you that may already be taking service under direct access arrangements may already be familiar with the concept of an exit fee and how that's imposed on a customer that leaves PG&E service for a competitive alternative. Over time, this charge is intended to go down, but lately has been quite a bit higher than we've expected. Nonetheless, the CCE economics on a projected basis still look very favorable. And so that's just something that is kind of a key driver of the comparison, and to the extent that exit fees move around substantially, clearly economics of the program could be affected. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that moving from 2015 to 2016, the exit fees within PG&E's service territory basically doubled, and yet the economics of the CCE program are still very favorable. And it's incredibly hard to imagine a scenario under which the exit fees could go much higher than they already are right now. So, I think all in all, whether we're looking at the base case or a broad range of scenarios, many of which are highly unlikely, the economics of CCE formation within the Silicon Valley look very, very favorable. And I think we can move on to the next slide. So just to wrap things up, touching on each one of the scenarios briefly here, I think each one of the scenarios demonstrates that this particular program is viable, and viable in very different ways depending on the supply portfolio composition. For scenario 1, clearly the CCE would be very viable on a rate competitive basis, but wouldn't offer very much in the way of environmental benefits. Scenario 2, there we kind of see a very nice balance between rate competitiveness and then also some significant GHG reductions as well as renewable energy increases. Scenario 3 was kind of a neat scenario in the sense that it demonstrated how renewable energy is becoming increasingly cost competitive with conventional energy sources. And even though there really wasn't any rate savings achieved under scenario 3, there was a tremendous level of renewable energy relative to the status quo, and also some very significant GHG reductions that were achieved in scenario 3. And at the end of the day, there's not necessarily a correct answer. And again, you're not constrained by any one of the 3 supply scenarios that were analyzed in the technical study. But I think the good news is you've got a lot of different options and a lot of different potential to assemble the pieces here from a supply perspective in a way that kind of optimizes both rate savings and also environmental impacts. And I think that's all.
Thank you, Kirby. Really excellent presentation of the details of this, summarized in a pretty short period of time. We're going to open things up for Q&A. We have had a few questions come in. I'll also point out that there's a copy of the slides available under the handout portion of your participant control panel. Yeah. So if you're interested in reviewing any of these slides as we go to put together questions, please do that. One of the first questions has to do with the impact on demand charges. So for a lot of our commercial customers, they're on tariffs that have both an energy portion and a demand portion to the bill. How does a community choice entity influence those two aspects of the energy bill, or impact those two aspects of the energy bill?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so some of you may be familiar that are on rate schedules, as many of you are, I'm sure, with demand charges, that certain of those charges fall on the delivery side of the bill, and then other of those charges fall on the generation side of the bill. And under the CCE service model, at least with the operating CCEs within California, tariff options that currently include demand charges under the IOU or bundled service model also will have demand charges under the CCE service model. So the idea with rate setting generally is that the structure of the rate that's offered to the CCE customer at the time that service commences will be generally similar to the structure of the rate that the customer is already used to under bundled service. So there's not going to be any wholesale overhauls as planned in that regard. And I think there's a lot of common sense in taking that approach so that you can allow for rate comparisons in a way that doesn't require any crazy calculations. And it also just will be something that's more familiar to the customer in terms of the bill that they receive and the charges that they're used to. So hopefully that answered your question. But if you currently have demand charges on your bill, you'll likely have demand charges under the CCE model. They just may be lower based on the technical study results.
Yeah, I've also seen in the case of Sonoma County, for instance, there is a generation portion of the demand charge that Sonoma County, the Sonoma Clean Power entity prices, and that price is a little lower than PG&E, but the other elements in the demand charge are larger, so the overall effect isn't real significant. But like you say, the overall structure remains the same. There could be some tweaks to an element of the demand charge that we could envision. Question here on participation by San Jose. Silicon Valley certainly includes San Jose. We're talking about a partnership in Silicon Valley. I guess I'll open that up to Melody. Sure. or Mayor Hendricks possibly.
Sure. So San Jose has taken its own path, and really when we were forming this partnership, they were not in a position of interest or resource allocation to really contribute to the partnership at that time. So they're taking their own path. I think they're taking a recommendation about how they want to move forward with considering community choice for their community to their council. I think it's in March. And early on, we were encouraged that our size, particularly as a collective partnership, is about the same as Marin and Sonoma combined. And so our size and scale, even as a band of communities, is more than sufficient to go forward with a successful program. And our technical study validates that.
Yeah, and I would also just add that San Jose could choose to go their own path. They could choose if they wanted to come join our joint powers group. They could, just like any other agency around. This is not exclude. If you didn't get in right at the beginning, you will not be excluded in the future.
I will just add, subject to the board's decision-making process.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct.
So a question of clarification here. Would it be correct to say that the goal of scenario 3 was to break even with PG&E, and in looking at that scenario, it resulted in a 76% renewable portfolio, or said another way, can we envision here that we could get to a 76% renewable portfolio at less than a 1% premium to PG&E? So maybe we can go back.
Yeah, the answer to that question. So we go back to, I think we could go back to. Okay, good. You got the right slide up there. Fantastic. Yeah. So the idea there, you're absolutely on point. Whoever asked that question, that's exactly what the scenario was kind of trying to capture, if you will, is how far can you push the needle in terms of renewable energy and overall GHG savings without going above PG&E during the 10-year study period. And so the answer to that question is, based on current market conditions at the time the study was completed, that's exactly what we found, is that you could go about assembling a portfolio with that level of renewable energy and that level of GHG savings without going over PG&E during the 10-year study period. And if you do open up the report, you'll see that it kind of starts at a slight savings, and then I think goes back to virtually equivalent, and then kind of goes back to savings, and then maybe I think in year 10 there's just literally a few cents of cost increase, something very minor, but over the 10-year period you've got rate equivalency. And of course, when we are looking at a 10-year study period, it's worth pointing out that nobody's got a crystal ball that works perfectly, so things are likely to change. But based on the information that we had at the time that the study was completed, that is kind of the way things looked in terms of what was possible in terms of environmental impacts while keeping it at rate parity. I hope that answers the question.
That should answer that one. Time for one or two more questions here before we go to a wrap up. But Kirby, can you take us through the rhythm of rate setting in your experience with Marin and Sonoma and Lancaster? What does that process look like? How often is it done? About say various commercial rate structures versus residential rate structures. How's that thought about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'll try to kind of not be too high level, but also not be too in the weeds here. But for the operating CCE programs within Northern California, the rate setting exercise has been one that's completed annually. So just one rate change each year. That rate change is typically preceded by a annual budgeting exercise by the CCE program. And of course that budget will determine the CCE's revenue requirement, if you will. So whatever your costs are, as you can imagine, you would want to set rates at a level that would allow you to recover all costs that were budgeted for the upcoming year. And then, of course, a second element of that process is determining what the utility rates are and how you're going to compare to utility rates. But that, while that's a very kind of important piece of the puzzle, the other exercises that I would argue are just as important are working through a cost of service analysis. So as you can imagine, each different tariff designation or customer group is going to have a different cost of service. Some customer groups are more expensive to serve than others. And in the interest of kind of fairness, each one of the CCEs that is operating in the state really does its best to assign costs and rates to customers in a way that very closely and clearly considers the cost of serving those customers. So it's not just a finagling of the numbers in such a way to make things look as good as they can for certain customer groups. It's really kind of looking at what does it cost to serve this customer group, what revenues do we need to collect in order to cover the costs associated with a particular customer group, and then of course setting rates accordingly. And then the way that the rate setting process works for the CCEs in California, there is typically a 60-day lead time, so the rates are introduced. We'll just use Marin Clean Energy as an example. Rates are typically introduced actually in February, so as it will be, I think, coming up in just a couple of weeks at MCE's February board meeting. Preliminary rates are introduced at that time with an opportunity for board discussion and public comment, and that opens a 60-day kind of review period, if you will, during which members of the public and interested stakeholders can offer comments about the rates that are being proposed, and then essentially 60 days later, so at a board meeting 2 months after the point at which rates are introduced, then rates are essentially adopted in consideration of the comments that were received during that 60-day review period, and then of course they go into effect and customers begin paying those rates. So I don't know if that was too high level or just the right level of detail. Hopefully it was okay.
That was excellent in terms of describing the general process flow and timeline. We're getting close to the end of the hour here. One question I'll briefly touch on as we wrap up. There have been questions about where the technical study can be found. It is accessible via the svcleanenergy.org website, and we'll show you the link for that here. If you look under the Resources tab, you can find a copy to download of the tech study report. In conversations that we've been having with prospective Silicon Valley clean energy customers, a few items have been sorting to the top in terms of the prospective business value proposition around community choice. Most fundamentally, CCE presents new energy choices and price points for commercial and industrial energy customers. And to quote some of the customers we've talked to, they say businesses like choice. What's not to like about having additional options? And then secondly, CCEs provide greener energy than the utility. And as the mayor pointed out, for businesses that are looking to reduce their GHG footprint, CCEs can represent a simple and cost-effective way of doing that. Other prospective benefits can include expanded access to local energy programs and incentives, including feed-in tariffs, energy efficiency programs, as you heard described, deployment of pilot technologies and tariffs to test new concepts, and so forth. And these things can really be done with a new speed that hasn't been necessarily the easiest thing to do under a regulated utility model. As you've seen in the presentation today, a lot is going to be happening with formation of the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Entity over the coming year, and we certainly want to keep the business community informed and engaged in the process. For larger energy customers and stakeholders, we're envisioning an ongoing series of webinars, in-person meetings. These will be held approximately quarterly with content updates that will build on the type of material that we've been presenting today and that we presented in November. For small and medium businesses, we're working on developing lines of communication through local chambers and other business organizations. The Silicon Valley Clean Energy website that I mentioned is a good resource for background information, presentations, frequently asked questions, recordings of the webinar, the technical study, and so forth. We'll continue to reach out to you about our business sector events, and You can officially register for general communications if you like via the Get Email Updates button that's on the website. We welcome your ideas. If you know of business groups in the area that are interested in learning more about SVCE, please send us a request. Your ideas and feedback and requests can be submitted via the Contact Us button at svcleanenergy.org. If you have colleagues that want to learn more about this, please forward our communications and contact information on to them. So in summary, thank you all for joining us today. And sorry, go ahead.
We do have one more question, Don.
Oh,
and
one
it's a good
additional
one.
question. All right.
In thinking about why to stay connected with us, we have a question that came in about whether the program is going to go with scenario 1, 2, or 3, and who gets to decide that. And that's a great way to a reason to stay plugged in. So which scenario we go with, or whether it's some version of a scenario that falls in between those, has not been decided, but will ultimately be decided by the board with input from the community, including our business community. So that's a great reason to stay engaged with us. We want to hear more about what's important to our business customers and what their preferences are. I will give some preview that it's probably between scenario 2 and 3, since most communities are looking at this for GHG emissions benefit. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Melody. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to our presenters, Glenn, Melody, and Kirby. We hope this has been useful for you, both as an update on the current status of formation of Silicon Valley Clean Energy and educational in terms of what community choice energy is all about. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.